Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to our weekly review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Mouin, as usual, it's a pleasure to host you on our weekly podcast.
Thank you, Nasim. And as always, it's a pleasure to be with you again as well.
Yeah, so Mouin, I want to begin. Well, I want to speak about the killing of five Al Jazeera journalists, amongst whom was Anas al-Sharif, the tragic death, and also his statement. I thought was a really moving statement. He should want to talk about him. A report from Doctors Without Borders about the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. And then we'll look at some of the other news from the region. But let's begin, I guess, with the main headline from the next phase of the Gaza genocide, which is Netanyahu. He issued a statement saying that Israel will occupy or take control of all of Gaza. And ahead of a cabinet meeting last week, he said that, and I quote, "We want to end the war very soon. It will be over speedily. And after taking control of the Gaza Strip, he will seek to grant control of Gaza to some unspecified Arab authority." We don't know what that means. It doesn't include the Palestinian Authority. It's not Hamas. So who he has in mind, we don't really know. So I guess let's begin with your thoughts on this new phase. I mean, we need to mention, Israel has flattened Gaza, conducted a war of annihilation, herded Palestinians into a concentration camp, and literally created conditions of living, which is intended to bring about the destruction of the Palestinians. So, what more can Israel do that it hasn't done already? What could the next phase be?
Well, if we look at Israel's formal statements, in March of this year, it launched a major military operation, which it called Gideon's Chariots, after it unilaterally repudiated the agreement that it had reached with the Palestinians in January. And Israel's new chief of staff, Zamir, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and others in the Israeli leadership gave very confident assurances that within several months, Gideon's chariots would result in the elusive total victory, annihilation of Hamas, release of the remaining Israeli military captives in the Gaza Strip, and all the rest of it. And as predicted by anyone with even cursory knowledge of reality, that's not what happened. And more importantly, Israel has been very closely focused on the systematic destruction of what remains of the Gaza Strip and areas under its control. It has spoken of expelling the Palestinians from the Gaza Strip with increasing openness, and it is seeking to create a reality of social breakdown, of anarchy and chaos, in addition, of course, to the growing famine in the Gaza Strip, in order to reach these objectives. And what has happened now is that Israel has put forward the details of a new military offensive, which is intended first to seize total control of Gaza City, and thereafter the central regions of the Gaza Strip. In other words, the town of Deir al-Balah and its three surrounding refugee camps, Nusayrat, al-Brij, and Maghazi. Now, there are conflicting reports about what Israel's real intentions are. According to one interpretation, this is exactly what Israel intends to do in order to force out the remaining population that is present in these areas, force them to the south of the Gaza Strip along the Egyptian border with a view to forcing their emigration, or if conditions are ripe, expelling them permanently from the Gaza Strip. Another interpretation is that this is intended to place pressure on Hamas in order to seek to extract further concessions from the Palestinians in the context of talks that are aiming to revive a ceasefire agreement. I think it's possible that both interpretations are correct. In other words, Israel intends to go through with this offensive, but at the same time, if Hamas were to accept Israel's conditions to end this campaign, basically to capitulate, to surrender, to disarm, to do anything and everything that Israel wants it to do, then it's possible that Israel will stop the bombing and proceed to other ways to seek to expel the Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. Netanyahu is already talking about final victory being in sight, whereas others who have looked at this say, you know, you're talking about a years long insurgency, that this is not something that can be achieved in the space of a week or a month. And more importantly, people are pointing to a depleted Israeli military in the sense that it is experiencing problems of manpower and materiel and won't be able to sustain the long-term physical occupation of the Gaza Strip as is being proposed by this plan.
So before we get to who Netanyahu hopes will take over, I mean, he mentioned it won't be the Palestinian Authority, it won't be Hamas. Focusing on the objective. I mean, if we look back in early October 2023, you had Blinken going to Egypt and Jordan, seeking to expel Palestinians from their territory. So that's always been the long-term plan, ethnically cleansing Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. Gazans haven't responded. Of course, many have been herded into the south, but there are many who remained in the north, despite Israel reducing the number of humanitarian aid convoys from 300 to something like 3 at the moment. There's only
From
3.
400 to 4.
So
Yeah.
400 to 4, despite demolishing the whole aid infrastructure, which the UN provided. Still, Palestinians are determined to remain in their homes, in the north, in Gaza City. And so I guess this is the next phase is really a response to that, response to the fact that the Palestinians haven't been, are unwilling or refusing to leave their homes because they know eventually the end game here is that once they are herded to the south and placed into concentration camps, they will never be returned back to their houses up in the north and in the central Gaza. That must be the calculation in the minds of many Gazans who still haven't moved to the south.
Well, yes, I mean, what you're saying is entirely correct. But there are multiple reasons why so many Palestinians appear to be determined to remain in their homes in Gaza City and the northern parts of the Gaza Strip. Part of it is exactly like you say. They know that once they leave, there will be no coming back. But there are also other reasons, which is that there is no safe passage from the north of the Gaza Strip to the center and the southern regions because so many are being killed by snipers, by drones, by bombing raids as they make the trek from the north to the south. And in addition to that, if they do manage to safely reach these so-called safe zones, there are constant bombings of the tent camps in those areas. So, you know, I think part of it are calculations of we know that once we leave, we will be permanently displaced and we won't accept this. Another one is that, you know, given that Israel is conducting a full-scale bombing campaign that is indiscriminately targeting civilians around the clock, wherever they are, the choice is basically, would you rather be in your home or in a tent somewhere in the south of the Gaza Strip? And so what Israel has chosen for now appears to be not an immediate invasion by ground troops of Gaza City, but what it's calling the encirclement of Gaza City, by which it will intensify the deprivation of basic supplies like food, water, medicines, and so on, even further, while launching intensive, constant bombing raids of anything and everything that moves in the Gaza Strip in the hope of physically terrorizing these people in an effort to drive them out of Gaza City. And, you know, after a week or a month of this, it will feel comfortable saying, well, anyone who's still here is a commander in the Hamas Qassam brigades.
Mm. And assuming that Netanyahu gets what he wants, what do you make of his plan for Gaza, which he announced on Thursday? I mean, we've kind of known this beforehand, that it won't be governed by Hamas, it won't be governed by the Palestinian Authority, but some Arab force. Who is this Arab force? Given in mind, Arab countries are not willing to commit to anything unless there is a pathway to a two-state solution. That's what they've said so far. So it seems the Israeli position and the Arab position, the gap between the two is increasing, by month. So, what do you make of that?
Well, here again, I think we need to distinguish between what Israel is saying and what it's doing. So, the Israeli position is that it will not accept any Palestinian governance in the Gaza Strip. Not that it rejects Hamas governance in the Gaza Strip, it rejects the Palestinian Authority or any other Palestinian. Against that, Israel has said that it hopes to install a kind of Arab expeditionary force that will rule the Gaza Strip on Israel's behalf, essentially, and guarantee Israel's security. But there's a fundamental problem here. First of all, no Arab state, no Arab government, including those most closely aligned with Israel, have volunteered to be part of this scheme. And second of all, the Arab states have collectively and individually made clear that they will only become involved in governance and reconstruction in the Gaza Strip if it is part of a credible and irreversible pathway to end the occupation and establish a Palestinian state, and if it is done within the framework of the Palestinian Authority. So there's a direct and irreconcilable contradiction between what Israel says it wants and what those who are supposed to play the role assigned to them by Israel have put forward as conditions. So that's kind of at the formal, visible level. But it's clear that what's going on, as I mentioned before, is that Israel is engaged in a systematic campaign to essentially to destroy what social cohesion remains within Palestinian society in the Gaza Strip, to destroy any capacity that the Palestinians have for law and order, for governance, for administration, and so on, whether by Hamas or anyone else, and to create a situation of such chaos and anarchy that Palestinians will increasingly feel that the only way they can save their skins is to leave, even if they do so in the knowledge that any exit will be permanent. As far as Arab cooperation in accepting masses of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip, that's simply not going to happen. As we've discussed previously, we've seen over the past 2 years that Arab governments are quite content to see Israel slaughtering Palestinians within their own homeland and are not prepared to do anything to bring this to a halt. But they draw the line at Israel expelling Palestinians to their own territory because they view this for multiple reasons as a threat to their national security, as a threat to their domestic stability, and perhaps most importantly, as a body blow to what remains of their own political legitimacy with their own public opinion.
Yeah, and so one of the first criminal acts which Israel carried out in this new phase is to kill five Al Jazeera journalists, chief amongst whom was Anas al-Sharif, is a
Yes.
prominent journalist known widely. So this happened as a result of a drone attack yesterday. We're recording this show on Monday. He was killed on Sunday. The drone struck a near al-Shifa hospital, where more than 270 journalists. Well, I mean, I should add that more than 270 journalists have been killed by Israel, and Anas al-Sharif is amongst them. So before I get your thoughts on that, I just wanted to point out that in the last 20 months or so, Israel has killed more journalists in Gaza than the seven past wars where the US has been involved, including World War One, World War Two, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Afghanistan War, Iraq, and more. So the Gaza has become really a graveyard for journalists, and not to mention that Israel is not permitting any Western journalists to go into Gaza, partly one would assume because Israel does not want to show its war crimes that it's committing on a daily basis.
Yes, well, this was a particularly despicable crime. I mean, you mentioned that the Gaza Strip has become a graveyard for journalists. That's certainly true. It's also been described by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres as a graveyard for children. We could add that it's also become a graveyard for UN personnel, for aid workers, for medical professionals, and on and on and on. Israel has been inciting against Anas al-Sharif for a very long time. And so the question that needs to be asked is not why did they kill him, but why was he murdered now? And I think this tallies quite closely with the first part of our discussion, which is that Israel is preparing for this massive invasion of Gaza City, has announced that it will do so. And what do you do first? Well, you kill the witnesses to make sure that as little news about what Israel is doing gets out. I'd like to make several points about this. Anas al-Sharif, Hamad Qreqa, their photographers and their drivers were killed when they were within a tent that was known to house journalists on or just outside the grounds of al-Shifa hospital in Gaza City. Rather than in previous instances where Israel has pretended, it didn't do this or it did this by mistake, this time it immediately claimed responsibility and, in fact, bragged about it. And this sought to present Anas al-Sharif as some kind of Hamas commander. Well, for those who have been following following the news on Al Jazeera Arabic over the past 2 years, Anas al-Sharif would have had to be superhuman to have played, even a tangential role in Hamas because he was literally reporting around the clock, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week since October 2023. And to bolster its claims, Israel put out these fabricated documents. I won't get into the details except to say the fabricated documents Israel put out in and of themselves invalidate its claims because one of them suggests that he was wounded in military training long before October 2023 and was no longer fit for military service. I'm not going to get into the legal details about the sanctity of civilian life and that, someone who is clearly identified as a journalist and working as a journalist cannot be targeted for assassination on the basis of their political affiliation and all the rest of it. And the reason I'm not going to get into that is because not only has Israel rendered these precepts thoroughly irrelevant, but the self-proclaimed guardians of international law, Israel's Western allies, have concurred that, at least as far as Israel is concerned, international law is irrelevant and the enemy and will be dismantled if Israeli impunity hangs in the balance. And what has been striking here is that Israel has been threatening Anas al-Sharif for a very long time, and the threats it has directed against him was to stop reporting, to stop broadcasting the reality of what Israel is doing in its genocidal military campaign in the Gaza Strip to the world, and particularly to the Arab world, because he broadcasts on Al Jazeera Arabic. So this man knew he had a target on his back. This man knew he was living on borrowed time. This man, who was only 28 years old, knew he was going to be killed before he saw 30 years. And nevertheless, and with extraordinary courage, he continued reporting, he continued broadcasting, he continued keeping us informed about the horrific genocide that was being unleashed on the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip by Israel. The other element I would like to bring into this story is that, of course, as you mentioned, more journalists have been killed in the Gaza Strip than in any other conflict during the past century. Actually, if I'm not mistaken, according to the available statistics, more than in all these conflicts combined. And the response of those who do not deserve to be called the colleagues of these Palestinian journalists because they're basically cowardly stenographers, and it would be an insult to the memory of Anas al-Sharif and his colleagues to refer to these journalists as their peers, has been total silence. I mean, you compare what has been happening in Ukraine and how Western journalists have been up in arms about and so much as a scratch to any Ukrainian journalist, and it's really one of the main scandals of this war. I mean, you had the bureau chief of the Washington Post in Jerusalem, who has said literally not a word about Anas al Sharif and all these threats. The first time he commented on this was after Anas al Sharif had been assassinated. And his story led with a reference to Israeli claims. You look at the BBC website today, and basically Israel's claims against Anas al Sharif more or less monopolize its reporting. And there's absolutely no effort to make clear that Israel systematically lies and fabricates in its accusations against these people. There's absolutely no effort to basically say that there is zero evidence to substantiate any of these Israeli allegations. But, they're the ones, these allegations in multiple Western media are the ones that are allowed to set the tone. Because again, Israel's purpose in putting out these stories is not to convince you that Anas al Sharif was a Hamas commander. It's to sow sufficient confusion that you will not take a clear position on this death squad state and its mafia tactics. I mean, imagine that for months they have been directly threatening him. If you don't stop reporting, you're going to be killed. His father was killed in a targeted assassination last year, and Anas al Sharif was convinced that this was a warning sent to him, in typical gangland fashion. And now he is no longer with us as well. And judging by the response of Western governments, and particularly of Western media, they have essentially now provided authorization to Israel to continue with its elimination of journalists in the Gaza Strip at a time when Israel is perhaps more insistent than it has been previously of eliminating the witnesses of prior to a further intensification of its genocide, this time against Gaza City. And I'll stop there. I did want to make
Well, I
one.
just want to, yeah, you can. I mean, I guess, I mean, on your last point that Israel is really trying banking on just sowing doubt in the minds of the public. But I think for a lot of people, I think it's Israeli playbook is quite familiar now, and most people, Israel's narrative and the playbook has lost its persuasive power. If you just look at social media and the number of people who understand that this is just really Israel fabricating lies, and Israel has been a chronic liar throughout the past 20 months and even before. And this is one of the, I would say, one of the, you know, it's a case of where the dam has completely broken, and people are really seeing the Israeli narrative for what it is. It's really a narrative put together by fabrications and lies, and we are seeing this really in a grand scale. And most people I'm listening to, I'm watching, they see this as part of that. The effort to discredit Anas al-Sharif is really part of that, effort to discredit all of the Palestinian narrative, and Israel is seen as a chronic liar. So I would make that point. But you wanted to say something else as well
Well,
regarding Anas
just one
al-Sharif.
last point. I mean, with this kind of propaganda put by Israel, they also say that no journalist in Gaza is allowed to do anything unless it's unless it's done at the behest of Hamas and all the rest of this BS. So we're now in a situation where Israel is um, seeking to discredit, seeking to delegitimize, seeking to demonize every single journalist in the Gaza Strip, and particularly those that are affiliated with Al Jazeera, because it's the best resourced and most visible media organization in the Gaza Strip. It's seeking to demonize, discredit, and delegitimize all of them, basically on the grounds that they're Palestinian journalists and therefore they can't be real journalists and they're all Hamas and all the rest of it. On the one hand, is seeking to do this, while at the same time systematically preventing any foreign journalists from entering the Gaza Strip who would then be in a position, should they have the courage to do so, about which I think we can rightfully place a very giant question mark, to examine these reports and test them for their veracity and so on. And so you have, very few journalists are actually saying, um, we trust what our Palestinian colleagues in the Gaza Strip are saying because they're working with extraordinary professionalism under impossible circumstances. If you want to raise doubts about their work, we will only take those doubts seriously if we can actually examine and verify them by sending in our own reporters. Instead, what we have is Western media essentially acting as stenographers for the Israeli military spokesman. Anything that Israel's military spokesman says is reported as serious news. Very different, than any other conflict. I think it would be fair to say that these Western news organizations showed greater skepticism about military statements by their own leaders and by their own military spokesmen in wars in which their own governments were involved than they have with respect to what appears to be for them the sacred genocidal apartheid regime of Israel.
Yeah, I mean, it is a mystery why Western media, given how Israel has been proven to be a chronic liar throughout, why they continue to trust the statements of Israeli commentators, spokesperson. It just beggars belief. But part of why the Israeli narrative, I guess, has lost its persuasive force is as we say, every week there is a international organization, international body, providing evidence, documenting Israeli war crimes and crimes against humanity. Last week we spoke about B'Tselem and its report on genocide titled Our Genocide. And this week there was another report by MSF, Doctors Without Borders, and they focused on the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and you know series of evidence showing that this has become the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has become a orchestrated killing. That's what they are doing, and I thought it was a really revealing report.
Yeah.
And so it goes on to show how um, this GHF, which we've spoken about at length, has become a kind of a militarized aid distribution mechanism. So I think the question I want to ask you is, if aid has become a weapon of war in Gaza, as it seems to be the case, would GHF be on trial for war crimes, crimes against humanity? Would the ICJ take that into consideration? Could we see that in the future?
I doubt it. And I'll explain why, but I agree with you that this is a very important report. It's from one of the world's leading humanitarian aid organizations, Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, and it's a very well-sourced and thoroughly researched report, which concludes basically that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has absolutely nothing to do with the distribution of humanitarian aid, and that its four facilities are, in its own words, sites of orchestrated killing and dehumanization directed at the Palestinians. In other words, the GHF has proven to be as important a weapon of war in Israel's genocidal arsenal as its F-35s, as its tanks, and as its D9 bulldozers. In response to your question, I think we now have to accept that there is not going to be accountability for Israel's genocide and crimes in our lifetime. We're already in a situation where key European states have, for all intents and purposes, repudiated the Rome Statute because they are giving Israeli leaders who have been indicted by the International Criminal Court and are international fugitives are giving them free reign of their airspace. Greece, I think Greece, Italy, and France come to mind. And basically, what we've been seeing for the past 2 years is that the West, not only the United States, but the West, including the European Union, has decided that it will dismantle any and every obstacle that stands in the way of Israeli impunity. It's a foundational, fundamental principle of the foreign policies of the United States and the European Union that Israel can act as it pleases, can do what it wants. The only restriction on Israeli conduct is that there can be no accountability for what Israel does. And so, therefore, I think it's extraordinarily unlikely that we will see Israeli war criminals being held to account and being sent to prison by the International Criminal Courts or any of that. Having said that, I do think that South Africa's case against Israel in at the International Court of Justice will proceed, unless the West manages to engineer a coup in South Africa. I think it will proceed, and I think it's by now more or less inevitable that the ICJ will rule that Israel is guilty of having perpetrated genocide in the Gaza Strip. If the ICC is not completely dismantled, it may well issue additional indictments of Israeli leaders. We could even see Israeli soldiers being arrested in Thailand or Mexico or other places. But the idea that the system of international justice is going to function in any way remotely approaching the manner in which it was designed to function, I don't see that happening, unfortunately.
Yeah, I remember very early on interviewing Raz Segal, one of the first experts on genocide, and he described Israel's actions on the Gaza Strip as early as October 2023 as a textbook case of genocide. And I remember him mentioning, asked him a similar question, and he said, as early as October 2023, that the international system is designed to protect Israel, and there is no way that system will now all of a sudden turn
Exactly.
on in Israel. And we are seeing that it rather dismantle the whole system rather than turn on Israel. And I think he's proven to be correct, 20 months
Unfortunately
later.
so.
Fortunately,
Yep.
so yeah.
Yes, I
Um,
mean, if I can just
yeah, sure.
briefly, the Egyptian Canadian author Omar al-Akkad has published this very powerful book. One day, everyone will have been against this, and he's basically making the point that all those cheerleading Israel today, or looking the other way, or remaining silent for reasons of opportunism or their careers or whatever, 20, 30, 40 years from now, they will all be basically writing memoirs about how they were the first to come out against this and demand to hold Israel accountable and so on. But I think, you know, we have reached a point of no return. Israel is now forever tainted by genocide, by apartheid, by its actions. It will never, ever have a reputation that is more positive than was that of the white minority regime in South Africa, for example. And down the line, everyone will start claiming. I mean, even Bono now has
Yeah.
come out of the woodwork. Imagine. So, but accountability is not going to come through the institutions that were established to impose accountability. It will come through political change ultimately. And that will be political change that results not from a struggle waged by those who view themselves as custodians of international law and international norms and values and so on, but rather by political struggle that is waged against them because they are doing everything possible, as you said, to dismantle these norms and values and institutions.
We were speaking earlier about how Netanyahu is already doing a victory lap, but then and on the other side, you have people like former Shin Bet director Ami Ayalon, who wrote this blistering article for Foreign Affairs, saying Israel is fighting a war it cannot win. So he goes in to explain why that's the case, that Israel has no strategic coherence in its policy towards Palestinians in Gaza. He criticized the so-called Abraham Accords, which he argues that left the Palestinians without any hope. And then he says that the only real solution to this is to adopt the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative, which we discussed last week. I mean, there's a lot of people like Aylon who are now coming out. They seem to be like jumping ship. But every time I hear these individuals, like Aylon, ex this, ex Israeli this, ex Israeli that, I mean, I was asked, who are they speaking to? I mean, the constituency in Israel to whom they're speaking to is diminishing by the day. Israeli public is really for this genocide. Israeli public cannot see space for Palestinians in Palestine. That's the bottom line. And so, who is his audience when he says these kind of things?
Yeah, that's a very pertinent question. Ayalon is an interesting character. He was, I believe, during the early 1980s, Israel's military attaché to South Africa, then still under white minority rule. Israel, of course, was the apartheid regime's closest foreign ally. So he was deeply involved in the Israeli effort to sustain its sister apartheid regime in South Africa. So he's seen these things up close. I guess he performed sufficiently well in South Africa that he was during the 1990s, immediately after the assassination of the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, appointed head of Israel's domestic security agency at a time when, for the first time, the Shin Bet began to also seriously monitor Jewish extremism because they weren't just launching pogroms against Arabs and killing Palestinian teenagers, but they were killing Jews. That's a big deal. So they have to be monitored and fought. And then Ayalon was one of this group of former senior Israeli security officials who believed that Oslo should have resulted in a two-state settlement because this was the only way to guarantee Israel's future in the region. And when they saw Israel basically repudiating peace with the Palestinians, they began to speak out with greater, more vocally. Um, Basically, they're acting from a perspective in which they see themselves primarily as seeking to guarantee Israel's security by making the point that unless Israel finds a way to peacefully coexist with the Palestinians, it is doomed. And what is interesting in this statement is that, again, he's basically applying the same principle by saying that Israel, if it does not agree to Palestinian administration in the Gaza Strip, if it insists on retaining open-ended permanent control of the Gaza Strip and begins, for example, with building Jewish settlements again and so on, that it is going to be stuck in a forever war, in a Vietnam, if you will, that it cannot win. Now, in response to your question about who are these appeals aimed at? Well, yes, in part, they're aimed at the Israeli public, but then you have this other initiative from last week by, for example, the former Speaker of the Israeli Parliament, Avram Burg, and about a dozen or 2 dozen other prominent Jewish Israelis. And that is very clearly directed not at their Israeli compatriots, but at the international community and specifically at Israel's Western sponsors and allies. And they are calling for these states to impose, I believe the term they used was crushing sanctions on Israel. And their message is basically Israel is too far gone. Is too far over the deep end. Israel has become too extremist to save itself. If you leave us to our own devices, we're finished. And the only way that this project can be saved is if you stop indulging us, if you stop ensuring we have impunity to for everything and anything we do, because if you keep doing this, we're doomed. We're going to drown in a basically in a crisis of our own making. So please save us by being a responsible parent.
Yeah, and when I read Berg and Ayalon, I mean, you think I couldn't help but thinking of the two of the founding pillars of Israel is collapsing in front of our eyes. One is the idea that Israel will be a safe haven for Jews. I don't think Israel Jews are probably more unsafe in Israel than anywhere else because of Israeli policies. And the other is that it will be a Jewish state, and I think more and more Jews are now looking at Israel as a liability. People like Berg, as you mentioned, he's calling for 1 million Israeli signatures in a letter calling for the ICJ to prosecute Israel.
Yeah.
So I think the pillars of Zionism are crumbling in front of our eyes, namely the two I just mentioned. The fact that the idea that Jews will be safe in Israel, and October 7 showed that they're the least safe there because of Israeli policies, Israeli annexation, Israeli colonization is not making Jews safe, not just in Palestine, but also elsewhere in the world. And a lot of Zionists around the world, a lot of Jews around the world are waking up to that fact.
Yeah. Berg, if I'm not mistaken, has in recent years repudiated Zionism and has come out in favor of a one-state solution because he feels that is the only way that the security of Israel's Jews can be guaranteed. In other words, without equality, without dismantling the apartheid regime, Israel's Jews are doomed to live in a state of permanent conflict with those who they have dispossessed. I believe I'm correct in my
I think
characterization.
you are. I have read that as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that also in part explains why he, in addition to him, along with others who signed that other petition we just discussed, are making their appeals not only to their own people, but to the outside world. This appeal by Burg that you just mentioned, I think, is directed primarily at non-Israeli Jews
That's right.
rather than at Israeli Jews. Save us from ourselves is a growing message among this sector of politically active let's say, non-genocidal Israeli Jewish activists.
Mm. I mentioned earlier Israel feeling like a sinking ship in every sense. I mean, last week also, a Palestinian American businessman, Bishara Bahbah, we spoke about him many months back, how he was instrumental in securing the release of former American Israeli hostage, Aiden Alexandra. So he announced that he will be withdrawing from the US negotiation team. So why did he do that? Is that a response to Israel announcing this new phase in his genocidal campaign? What was behind him withdrawing his support for the Trump administration?
Well, in part, Bishara Bahbah, as we've discussed before, is a Palestinian American entrepreneur who was, I believe, head of organization named Arab American Republicans for Trump. In other words, he's a Republican activist, and became involved in this issue when Hamas reached out to him to send messages to the Trump administration in order to get the negotiations for a ceasefire back on track. So he was very much, his role was very much that of a messenger more than that of a mediator. But what has happened is that, in his view, the negotiations were proceeding well. There were very, very few issues left to be resolved. He felt that Hamas was showing constructive flexibility in resolving these few remaining issues. And not only did Israel then walk away from the negotiations, but more importantly, from his perspective, Steve Witkoff, the American envoy, walked away from them as well, and thereby collapsed the negotiations. Now, of course, we'll hear all kinds of accusations, how Bishara Bahbah is Hamas and all the rest of it. If I'm not mistaken, he's from a Christian family. Hamas, of course, is an Islamist movement, so it doesn't quite work out that way. And but his statement expressed disappointment, anger, I think primarily with the Americans for indulging Israel's sabotage rather than Israel's sabotage as such, which I think anyone with brains considers a given and understands that the real decisions are going to be made by Washington, and therefore what Washington does is much more important than what Israel thinks or seeks to do. And he felt he had been suckered by the Americans and said he would no longer be cooperating with them. I have to say, it would, I think, be useful if the Arab governments that are involved in mediation were to take a similar position. If Qatar and Egypt would stop playing this game of allowing the Americans and the Israelis to pretend that there are serious negotiations and basically saying, when you're serious, give us a call. We're going to go spend some time at home. I think that could help generate some pressure on the Americans and thereby on the Israelis. Would it work? Perhaps not, but at least we would be relieved of this charade.
I mean, that is one of the reasons why Israel keeps saying all it requires for the war to end is for Hamas to release the hostages. And we've seen
And
over the
surrender.
last 20 and so over the last 20 months, there's never been a good faith attempt to
No.
address the key issues. And Hamas has always been willing to release the hostages in exchange for an end to the genocide. So with as you mentioned, with Arab countries continuing
Mm.
with this facade, they are
Mm.
giving Israel the kind of the green light, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, imagine, you've been waging war against a group for two years. You have the most powerful military in the entire region, one of the most powerful militaries in the entire world. You're fighting this second order militia that is primarily armed with locally manufactured rudimentary weapons. For 2 entire years, you've been unable to defeat it, despite constantly crowing about total victory and imminent victory and all the rest of it. For 2 years, you've been unable to achieve what you claim is your primary objective. And then you go to negotiations and demand that it surrender as part of any ceasefire. I mean, you know, why does Israel expect to receive at the negotiating table what it has consistently failed to achieve on the quote unquote battlefield? It makes about as much sense as Hamas saying it will only accept a ceasefire once Israel accepts to dismantle its key state institutions. I mean, and it's repeated constantly, not only by Israel's apologists, but by Western politicians and governments. Explain to me on what basis a party that has not been militarily defeated is supposed to just say, okay, you know what? We surrender. You win, even though you haven't won. It's completely disconnected from reality.
And talking about disconnected from reality, I think we should turn our attention to Boris Johnson, the former UK Prime Minister, who, in a statement last week, he said that Taiwan has, more rights to being a state than Palestine. And he gave his explanation, which is that it has a recognized government, boundaries that they control, and a proper democratic system. That's his criterion for what is a state, what is not a state. Given the fact that 147 countries recognize Palestine and only 12 countries recognize Taiwan, UK does not recognize Taiwan and follows a one China policy. Israel also does not have a recognized border. This, of course, comes on the back of a number of countries declaring that they will recognize a Palestinian state, including the UK in September. Australia, I think, is the latest country to do that. So, yeah, just your thoughts on Boris Johnson intervening in his buffoonery manner.
Yeah. I mean, you said it. The guy's a buffoon. He's a clown. He's an international laughing stock. We've all seen him in action. You can't watch or listen to Boris Johnson without laughing. Not with him, but at him. The guy was British Prime Minister for several years. If you feel so strongly about this issue, what was there to stop him from recognizing Taiwan? He had every opportunity to do so, but he didn't. So why should we take him? Why should we take him seriously now? He's trying to curry favor with his hosts in Taiwan, who presumably paid him a pretty penny to come and speak at one of their conferences. He made his typical buffoonish statements about the Middle East, as he's been doing throughout most of his career. Basically, I think at one point suggesting that Hamas launched its attacks on October 7th in order to force Britain to recognize Palestinian statehood. And now they've achieved that. And so they've won, but at the same time they should surrender. Come on, which is it? No, I think interestingly, shortly after the speech, just on Monday morning, if I'm not mistaken, the Australian Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, indicated that his government intends to recognize a state of Palestine during next month's session of the UN General Assembly. And a short while later, the foreign minister of New Zealand indicated that his government is in discussions about potentially doing the same, making clear that recognition of Palestine is, from New Zealand's perspective, a question of a question of when, not if, in his words. And again, the key issue now is, will these recognitions be limited to these kinds of symbolic, not insignificant, but ultimately symbolic measures, or will we see real concrete measures to address the intensifying genocide on the ground in the Gaza Strip and the intensifying process of annexation in the West Bank?
Yeah, let's end with these shameful scenes from London over the weekend, where we saw the elderly, the blind, grandmoms, granddads, and peaceful activists being arrested and hurled into police vans for protesting against the Gaza in genocide. So this, of course, is on the back of the UK prescribing Palestine action. We spoke about that earlier, and it's quite a well-known story. But there was a number of other reports that came out showing that Lord Richard Dunnett, who was a former head of the British Army and is a member of the House of Lords, so he's under scrutiny for lobbying for Palestine action to be prescribed. So there's a whole series of articles showing how many of these individuals are placating, the genocide, Israel, and just get your thoughts on that, and we'll conclude with that. And I guess the most powerful symbol from the weekend is that those protesters were being arrested in front of the statue of Nelson Mandela, which stands probably 150, 200 meters in front of House of Commons, which is quite a powerful symbol. And I think if there is a iconic figure of protests against the Gaza genocide in the UK, I think that would be it. Protesters, elderly protesters, blind and frail protesters, pro-Palestinian activists being hurled in front of the statue of Nelson Mandela into police vans. That probably be the abiding, image of the shameful behavior of the UK government.
Yeah, I mean, we've spoken often, and today again, about how Western states are determined to dismantle international institutions, international law, international norms and values, if that is required to perpetuate Israeli impunity in its dealings with the Palestinian people. What we see here also is that states are prepared to dismantle their own domestic systems of law and so on in order to protect and defend Israel. So here you have a situation where an activist group, Palestine Action, which has taken direct action, but never engaged in violence against anybody, has been prescribed as a terrorist group, something which was very widely condemned and denounced also from within the legal profession in Britain. And we've now gotten to the situation where if you hold up a sign saying, I oppose genocide, I support Palestine action, you will be treated according to the same criteria that is applied to members of Al-Qaeda or ISIS. In other words, terrorism legislation, British domestic law, police activity, and so on, all of that has been subordinated to the defense of Israel and the promotion of its impunity. And according to press reports, between 400 and 500 people were arrested at this protest yesterday, over half of them over the age of 60. We've seen, if I'm not mistaken, a week or two ago, a Holocaust survivor was arrested. Clerics have been arrested. The infirm have been arrested. But all this is worth it because the alternative is treating Israel like a normal state. And I think it would be, from the perspective of the British government, it would be better to have what passes for the British Constitution, the British system of law, and so on, better to dismantle all of that and burn it to the ground than have to apply it to Israel as well. That's really what's going on here, and then of course, you have this Lord Lord Dennett, and apparently, if I'm not mistaken, under British law, it is not permitted for members of the House of Lords to engage in lobbying. Well, he was previously caught on video offering to arrange meetings, I believe, for an arms supplier with British ministers, and he has now been caught with his pants down, seeking to lobby the police and others in order to prescribe Palestine action, not because of any beliefs he has in the issue, but because he is also a paid lobbyist for one of the arms companies whose equipment was damaged in one of the actions by Palestine Action. And this is apparently quite illegal, but it's for Israel, so it's not illegal, and there will be no consequences, and the genocide will be allowed to continue.
Yeah, I mean, this reminds me after 9/11, Muslims were constantly told, respect British values, you need to abide by British values. But when British values come into contest with support for Israel, who cares about British
Israeli
values?
values, we always
Israel
win.
first again.
Mm.
As always, Mouin, thank you again for joining us this week. Hope to see you again next week for another, hopefully a fascinating conversation.
I look
And
forward to it. Thank you, Nassim.
see you all for thank you all for tuning in. See you next week. Bye bye.